of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
Okay, we have a quorum. Daniel is not here.
I just talked to Lucas and he said he is sorry, but he will not be here either.
You do need to make a motion to excuse Lucas' absence, yeah.
I'll entertain a motion to excuse Lewis.
I will second the motion to excuse Lucas, not Lewis.
and I'll make the motion.
Okay, you did it.
We did it backwards.
Yeah, we sort of did. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Anyways, let's get back to this in just a second here. Everybody had a chance to look at the business licenses.
Mhm.
I didn't see. Did you? Did I get a motion for the approval of the consent agenda?
So,
Seconded.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
aye.
Aye. Motion carries. And let's see, it looks like we're down to a discussion on zoning code development.
Do we want to continue with the one we were having, or would you like to go with the agenda item, which was the development of the residential code?
If you don't think they're a segue and we should continue our discussion, we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, they're related, but kind of different topics.
Okay, carry on.
So I think we were talking about employment densities, you know. I can do some more research onto limitations of larger scale uses. You know, we might make them conditional uses in those zones. That way, if somebody does get a shell approved and end up using it for distribution or other type warehousing type use, then they'd have to come back for a conditional use permit. And that would give you some discretion in how you approve those.
Yeah, I always like conditions of approval.
Yeah, so, but an answer to Mr. Hill's simple question is once you've allowed it in the zoning code, then you have to approve it if they come in and they meet the conditions of the zoning code. You don't have discretion unless you make it a conditional use, and then you can examine it for compatibility and other things.
Does anybody do that?
I haven't seen that done for the industrial distribution. I mean, usually it's just an allowed use in industrial zones. It was for a long time, and I do represent industrial clients too. And I've done permitting for those buildings. From the applicant side, and I've never come across, concerns from community about jobs, but there's never anything in the zoning code that requires it.
What, I'm thinking of, well, a couple of different things, but one specifically right now, just outside the town of Rochester. In fact, it's in Rochester. Is a pole yard. Now, it's not necessarily real loud, but something like that could be, because the equipment that's used to move poles around it needs to be pretty big. But in the summertime, the dust is incredible. I wouldn't want to see necessarily that sort of heavy industry close to residential areas that we would have out that way. I mean, somebody could come in and put in 100 house development, and then the next person come along and put in a long yard.
I think we've discussed this in the past though, and we sort of set a dividing line between residential and commercial industrial as Henrietta. Remember we were looking at the creek for one time and we wanted our commercial industrial to be closer to the intersection of the freeway and 505.
When we were talking about that, we only had two options, residential and commercial. So now you have a lot more options for painting that zoning map. So that commercial color that's on our previous map that we looked at also included industrial uses.
Right, I understand that, but I think we had defined though pretty, and we had given ourselves leeway to, okay, now. We're gonna have residential here, we're gonna have industrial, commercial over here. Now, how we spread those out and what we do with each parcel or general area. Is a lot different than planting residential right next to industrial, which I think we don't have any intention of doing.
Right.
Um,
I think the way it works is the commercial center is around the interchange and then you work back from there.
and then we'll drive the development.
And then the commercial will drive the development. Then you have some industrial employment area and then using maybe the creek or Henrietta as that dividing line, then you transition into the higher density residential stuff that you don't want in your downtown core.
Right.
Some of the highest densities in Toledo would be out behind that commercial center property. So, but for the discussion of the types of uses that you want in your industrial zone. I can do that research and that's what we're talking about here is, you know, for industrial and commercial, what do you want? What do you not want? I'll go back and do the research and like I did with the residential code, I'll come back with a draft of it and we can go through that and see how close I hit the mark. And if I didn't, we'll go back and do it again.
Okay, yeah.
So I think I'm hearing pretty clearly that the heavy industry piece may be something that Toledo's not too interested in. I mean, the obvious way to do that is to not, I mean, there's nothing that requires you to allow a 1 million square foot warehouse in your city. You know, you have to have some things that are allowed in your city, but warehousing and distribution so what you do is you regulate the size. But then if somebody wants to come in and do, you know, a 1 million square foot manufacturing facility, they wouldn't fit here either. You know, if your maximum building size is 100,000 square feet or 500,000 square feet or whatever that number seems right, then that would limit some of those uses. You'd still end up with smaller scale distribution and warehousing.
Yes, yeah, that's what I was thinking, 'cause I'm thinking about like when Reichert's was on Kangas. I'm
Okay,
thinking about that place, that mill out in Morton, that's surrounded by houses,
two before, yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
then that, but that, the one in Morton's pretty heavy, it's at least
It's bigger.
100 employees, right?
Well, yeah, and you don't want to discourage employment like that. I mean,
Right.
that's great, but at the same
Yeah.
time, when you put a sawmill in, that's a high impact in a lot of different ways.
Right,
So we'll try to place those industrial uses.
light versus heavy,
Well, do you want to divide it up into 2 industrial zones?
Heavy and light,
You're better doing that.
heavy and light industry, maybe. Of course, then you have to define what's light and what's heavy.
Well, that's true, but I can do that. Now's the time to have that discussion before I start developing code. And I did give some examples here of what other jurisdictions have done and, you know, for the commercial and industrial zones. Using Kalama and Kelso, Napa Vine. So I did those comparative uses and, you know, Kalama has 4 different commercial zones.
well, that's interesting.
Didn't I do a table for industrial?
Kalama has a
Yeah, it's on
chemical,
that next page.
Yeah, the next page is industrial. Kalama has 2 industrial zones, Kelso also has 2, and Napa Vine also has 2, the light
Light and heavy,
and general, light and heavy. So those, and you can see in that table, this is. When am I ever going to put page numbers on these? This is on. Thought I'd set that up in all my templates, so the page numbers always were there. This is on page, this is the last page, it's the comparative table of industrial zoning districts and allowed uses.
And they look, I mean, they look all alike and they make perfect sense.
Yeah, I think in the industrial zone. Most communities I see kind of stick to this framework. So if we were to align 2 different industrial zones, then. Take the industrial zone and fragment it into 2, the light and the heavy.
Mhm.
And then we could look at that map next month in our workshop and make sure we're painting the correct areas. I'll come with a draft. Based on. What I think we might like, and then we can change it from there.
yeah, good, that's
Okay.
great.
So 2 industrial zones, light and heavy. And the uses that are allowed there. I guess that you'd probably want the heavy industrial to also include the larger distribution warehousing type facilities.
Yeah, I would imagine like based on the traffic, that you could also have that be heavy square footage traffic. Would designate that for me at least, thinking about that.
Usually, I think in the jurisdictions in our examples here, the heavy is the bigger and stinkier stuff, not necessarily larger. You know, other than traffic and truck trips, you know, industrial distribution or warehouse distribution and warehousing is usually not big and stinky, other than,
Yeah, right.
other than the diesel trucks rolling in and out. And there is community concern about that too, making sure that you don't cite those around residential districts because of the fumes and the smoke, but
And the road damage.
and the road damage, yeah. So it's up to you though, as a community, would you rather see those larger scale uses in your heavy industrial districts? But that would then take up, because the heavy industrial is also usually labor intensive,
Right,
you know, so that would eat up your jobs lands with lower density employment uses, whereas light industrial also is a very labor intensive. So it's kind of a toss, I guess.
I like their highway commercial. We're not gonna have very much of it, but
Well, probably for us, that'll just be commercial. We just allow all those uses in the commercial zone and then paint the areas around the highway. But for industrial, can we just get to,
light in general or light in heavy.
well, we got those two, but where do we want to put the warehouse and other uses? Or do we want to make sure that nothing that large is allowed in Toledo?
well, I like what you said, I had not thought about what you said about the infrastructure. Big warehouses, yeah, they don't employ a lot of people, but they have to set up an infrastructure, and then that allows other people to piggyback off that. I hadn't thought about that, but it's true.
And I think there's a huge demand for warehousing and distribution facilities in the I-5 corridor, both coming in and out of Seattle and coming in and out of Portland. You know, where things arrive by rail and by boat. So there's a huge amount. of
But
need
that
for
comes in, that comes with like, like a built-in quid pro quo, like you, like, if you're gonna come out here with this and you're not gonna be heavy industrial, you're still gonna have to do your infrastructure build, your water, draw the water out here, which would then enable other people to piggyback on you. So how would you designate that? Yes, we'll allow you to develop if you,
Well, so that would be a requirement of development. In order to get the water to you, you're gonna have to build our water system plan because that's what's in our plan.
okay,
And then that's the requirement. And if you don't require that much water, then a lot of communities will allow them to do latecomers agreements so that as other people develop, they pay their proportionate share, which is easier to do than fronting all the money for the infrastructure. So it discourages any development to have to upfront all that money, even the large scale,
sure,
you know, but still, if there's a way to recoup it on the backside, that makes it less painful in the long term. And then it also allows everybody to pay a proportionate share as they come in and use that rather than not. So using those big uses that I think are very likely in that area of future Toledo to then provide for infrastructure, even though it's not getting you the jobs you want directly. Right? And it'll get you the infrastructure extensions and it'll get you some indirect jobs and employment.
I had considered the maintenance and repair aspect of a building that big.
The other thing is, the infrastructure in there is oftentimes property and it's taxed. So when you see a manufacturing facility, we did a large steel warehouse and cutting facility, and the infrastructure inside the building was actually part of their property taxes. So the city got a bump in the property tax revenues from the equipment that goes inside. And I think all the racking and other systems are similarly classified for the distribution. So there might be some other ancillary benefits.
From the standpoint of drawing a line let's say from the curve as you go out of town on 63 and on 505.
Mhm.
Okay, and that's where the 40-mile-an-hour zone is, and then you head out and you go out and there's Henrietta, yeah, whatever it is. I keep thinking, I'm misspelling the sign.
I could be pronouncing it wrong too. Could be.
And then there's Highway 5. I kind of like want to get a sense of, okay, so we've got this as residential, we've got this as commercial, and industrial. Now, where do we place? Let's say our light industrial, do we allow our light industrial, which is the tech startups and the things like that? Do we want them closer to our residential and push our heavy industrial commercial towards the freeway, but then we want that area right at the freeway to be available for highway commercial type activities, restaurants and things like that. So when we're doing that and we start planning our residential zones, how do we want our high densities next to the light industrial versus our single family homes, et cetera. And that's, kind of like filling all the checkerboards of where we want things to be.
Right. Well, so I think tonight in our meeting discussion, that next month I'll bring back a draft of the map. For where, so with a proposed outline for where I think those zones fit in. For the urban growth areas and all the other pieces. And like I said, we can tweak the map after you look at it, and that may be an easier way to have the discussion that you're trying to have here, is if you got something in front of you. The things I'd like to get away from tonight are what we're talking about, 2 industrial zones instead of 1. The warehousing and distribution. Maybe going into heavy industrial instead of light industrial. And then looking, so I think if that concludes industrial, maybe to move on to then looking at commercial in the different zones. Like I said, Kalama's got, for a small town, they've got 4 commercial zones.
Yeah, it's like a unique situation.
It's similar to what you will become. I mean, you're similar to a lot of other I-5 communities that have relative proximity. I mean, Kalama's extremely proximal to I-5 because it goes right through the middle of their community, and they're also limited. They have some other unique topography in that there's a hillside right behind the downtown core. So, I mean, but they also, they've got areas now that they've annexed in at the interchange north of town. And they did a mixed use zone because the port owns all that, and the port wanted to do a mix of, they're not interested in doing residential, but they're interested in doing everything commercial and industrial. So they tried to create a flexible zone that would allow them to do that. So they do have some pretty innovative concepts, and then they do reach down to the truck stop on the south side of town too. So they do have a lot of commercial zones, but their situation isn't really that unique compared to yours.
Okay.
Cause you'll have a highway interchange eventually, you'll have areas in town, it's all the same. You don't have a port, so, you do have a port, but you don't have a port with property in town. So that maybe is one added complexity to Kalama that you don't have, but it's not so different. So for you though, Napavine has 2 different, they're a closer community to you. They just have 2 different community commercial and general commercial. And the general commercial allows the larger scale and the smaller scale. So, or is maybe just 1 commercial zone good enough, because you're also limited, because the only parcel you've got designated as commercial now is the grocery store. And that's a relatively small parcel. You're not going to be able to put a large scale retail operation on that. It's basically maxed out with what it is. So then you're only talking about new uses out in the junction, and to allow more flexibility by having less zones. If you just have a commercial zone and you allow everything commercial from small box to big box, then you're allowing a developer to come in and choose what works best there. Right? So you're allowing more flexibility. If you paint colors and you say, okay, well, we only want our big box here and our small box here. Well, maybe the big box pieces aren't for sale yet, so you don't get that, right? Whereas some of these other pieces may be for sale, or so you won't be able to track the broad audience you will if you have fewer zones.
Yeah, I'm used to developers actually developing a large, let's say, retail complex and selling them to the big box stores, their particular area, some buy or some lease. So that, and then there's parcels remaining on that commercial zone that fit just everything under the sun, whether it's a coffee drive-through, a Denny's, a retail strip along one edge or not, but they all are encompassed into one giant development.
Mhm.
And I think if you paint little tiny boxes everywhere, you can eliminate that. I mean, somebody who's very good at what they do in that particular field can come to you with a plan that will make a lot more sense than us sitting here trying to say, little one here and front of one, big one go along over here. And they can mix those uses and make them actually compatible with each other.
The big and the small commercial uses together in one zone.
So you're saying, Steve, just call it commercial,
I would,
just go with commercial.
I mean, eventually they're gonna come to us anyway, and we're gonna have to look at it.
You will, but if it's allowed in your code, then you won't be able to not approve it. You can't take a big box use that you don't want if you allow big box uses in that zone.
Because I would allow like just fat warehouses right up the hill, right? By the school.
So commercial, so a commercial use would have to be retail or offices or something like that.
Yeah, brand industrial.
But if you don't have separate commercial zones, then somebody could come in and do, you know, a multi-story office up to your height limit in your commercial zone. And have that be there. Whereas with multiple zones, you can say, okay, well, we're only gonna allow 2-story offices in this zone. In this zone, we'll allow 4-story offices, and the same thing for retail. You know, your larger big box retailers. If you just have one commercial zone, they can go anywhere in there. And if you have multiple commercial zones, you can say, yeah, they can't really go here, but
Right.
they can go over here. So that's the benefit of having multiple zones, is that you can control where they go. But the downside of that is you have less choice for people who are coming in and developing those. Maybe they feel like for either market of the properties or the price or the location or something else, they want to put it here, but that's zoned wrong, so they can't. So now you've eliminated that use from your community because you didn't have a parcel to suit them. But if you just have the one commercial zone, then all of your parcels would suit them.
I agree with what you're saying, but I have not had any instances in all developments that I've done where we haven't ended up sitting down with the city and coming to a meeting of the minds is what makes sense as what the city wants versus what I'm trying to build. With regards to saying, well, somebody's just gonna come in and build a maximum height office building. Well, they may want to, and they may be able to, based on our regulations, but if you sit them down and we talk about, do you ever want to do business here again, or how difficult can we make this for you, which is a conversation I've had at least dozens of times, is that how can we make this parcel do what you want it to do and make it more acceptable to the city? And generally, people are of a mind that that's the better way to do business, not ramming it down the city's throat because your regs say this, we're going to do that this way, whether you want us to or not.
Have you ever met Walmart?
I haven't met Walmart.
Have you ever met a community that doesn't want a Walmart, but ends up with a
Have you ever
Walmart
met
exactly?
anybody who worked for Walmart?
No.
Every
I don't, but
every contractor and subcontractor that I know in the Northern California Bay Area has worked for them once
so
and will never work for them again.
So I hate to call out a specific retailer, but that is a prime example in a community where they don't care what you want as a city. They're an allowed use and they will fight and they will sue you if you try to infringe on their right to develop a
And
building.
also typically want sales tax back for the benefit of them coming to town, and we do.
They are a huge sales tax generator, and I think they've done a lot for the communities that they've moved into for sales taxes, but
Keeping them.
No,
closer
they
to the
come back,
freeway
they
would be-
come
that
back
would
in
be
and
doing
say,
their
well, you're gonna
different-
pick up.
Different
4%.
commercial
Right, so
zones.
we'd be able to do different commercial zones, keeping them closer to the freeway.
so then, yeah, they might be able to do a neighborhood store, which is a smaller format of what that retailer does, but they wouldn't be able to do their big box multi-stores. But then, of course, then you'd also be eliminating the other ones too, that are like, Fred Meyer's is a prime
Home
example
Depot.
that does that. Home Depot is usually single product, but that would limit the size of a Home Depot that you'd allow too. So you have to consider that. But no, while it may have been true in your history that you've worked for developers who will talk to the city, it's not always the case. Sometimes a developer is allowed to do a use and they want to do it there, and they've got money invested and they've got time on the line, and they, if they're allowed to do it, they will fight the city and do it anyway. If your regulations say they can.
We have Walmart walk away from two different areas.
Does it work on the inverse?
They walk in the front door and they say, we can guarantee you $1 million a year in sales tax. And we want $400,000 of it back. And cities will sign that, say 600 is better than nothing.
Does it work in the inverse where we could zone it this year, that there? And then if somebody comes in and they wanna develop, we can change it.
You
to
can rezone.
Allow.
You can rezone. Sure.
So would it be any sweat off of our backs to,
So you won't make the initial blush. I mean, when they do those things, they do them on a regional scale. When they do that, they say, you know, this is the area we're looking at doing a new use. Show me all the parcels that are in that area that meet our needs,
I
you
see.
know, and they give a list of criteria. And then the parcels that don't meet that criteria are thrown out. And only in the odd sense that there aren't any suitable parcels, then do they expand their search to things like, okay, well, what parcels can be easily changed to meet our needs?
Sure.
But if there's a parcel that meets their needs in one of the neighboring communities, they're just as happy to locate there because it serves their market area for a retailer. You know, if all else is equal,
but you do deter the initial search?
but
What other pain in the butt? Right.
But when they call, you know, when they call City Hall and say, where do you allow these uses and what properties, which they will do if they're searching in this area. And then, you know, City Hall pulls up the zoning map and says, well, this is where you're allowed to go on these parcels over here. And if that doesn't meet their criteria, then they'll move on. Or one of those parcels may be a candidate and they may pursue it for a while and they may end up locating there. But if it's not zoned appropriately, City Hall would never tell them you can go here, just change the zoning. Right? I mean, that's not something we say. You know, when they ask, where is this use allowed? Here's where it's allowed. That's what the map says. That's what the code says. So they don't ever bubble to the top of the search criteria.
Yeah.
Occasionally you'll see a developer who wants to do something and pre-prep it. You know, one of the local people might say, I know I can rezone that piece, and then they'll come in and rezone it, and then they'll go out and market it to the people that they're trying to attract. A lot of commercial center developers do that.
Okay. Interesting.
How many acres do we have to play with?
No, 100 some, about 100. What did we figure? It's a pretty large area.
I don't know, one fifth of that is being taken up by a single building in Longview. A 1 million square foot building,
I did the permitting for that one. And it's in Kelso.
20-acre building, isn't it?
It's a very large building.
Which one is that, Steve?
So, down by Talleyway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, what is that? That thing-
Oh, yeah,
Just a
yeah, yeah.
warehouse, huh? Huge.
It's not tenanted yet, so,
Hmm.
but it's one of those
Right
subdivided
on
buildings.
36,
So
right?
they
Yeah.
could have,
Yes.
they could have multiple tenants in that building, or it could be all one.
It is huge building. A
It's
lot
beautiful,
of,
isn't
lot
it?
of tilt up.
Concrete tilt though.
Hmm.
I thought they saw their heyday and they went away for a little while and they came back.
So that the how much area you have kind of depends on where we draw the lines, but we are probably looking at, you know, 100 to 150 acres of commercial. Just depends on when we bring the map back next month where you put the line. That's a balance between commercial and industrial.
A little known fact that Walmart has a specification for the type of rock that you're supposed to put under their building pad. And it's a specification that came out of their offices in the south. And they don't change them. If you have your rail card in, that's what they will have you do,
All the way from Arkansas.
all the way from wherever it's available. We had to pull some from, I think, Southern Oregon to meet the standard for a Northern California store.
It's interesting. So, well, and I unfairly picked on that retailer, but there are others that are
They're a monster. too.
that are not wanted in
Pick on them all
communities.
you
So-
want.
We don't want
said-
Walmart.
And everybody's worked for Walmart, come on.
But when you were saying that, you know, developers play nice and come talk to the city, I thought, you know, that's the one prime example that comes
Yeah,
to
yeah.
mind. Because cities oftentimes will fight tooth and nail, especially in a small town. And
I don't think our citizens would mind a Walmart out there in the boonies somewhere.
you'll hear from your downtown business owners. And really, you're going to hear from them anyway. When you allow retail development out around the junction, the argument's gonna be, well, people are gonna stop there and they're not gonna come downtown. You're gonna close my restaurant, you're gonna kill my business, because now these people that drive into town to get food aren't going to do that. All the people that drive into town to do these things are gonna have that.
Attaches Starbucks or McDonald's to the Walmart,
Well, that's the
Betty's
cycle.
and all the coffee shops. would
That's the
get-
cycle Castle Rock went through.
Yeah.
And they're just now recovering, they're down.
And the thing about it is you have to look into the future about making your downtown core a destination spot,
Mhm.
a tourist attraction all by itself, by having cute little shops along your main drag and places for people to park. And flower beds and the flower hanging baskets and the things that Castle Rock has worked so hard to do. But that doesn't happen until you have money. And you have to build your revenue generation and to obtain the money to do that. And like you said, it took them almost 10 years.
Mhm.
From developing their first commercial stuff out by the freeway to finally having enough revenue to start doing redevelopment downtown, redoing the streets and cobbles. And all the money that they put into that little downtown area. Now Castle Rock is a nice place to go for lunch. And you pass right by the McDonald's, and you don't even give it a second look, you know, you go downtown to a little restaurant you like. That's what we better shoot for here, because
Well, I think it's going to be a discussion with your downtown businesses regardless of how many commercial zones you have. If you're putting a commercial sector that's outside of town and doesn't draw people to them, then it's going to hurt them regardless of what scale it is. I mean, if you allow anything out there in a different commercial area, it's gonna take away from their customer base on some
well,
level.
we can't survive on 2 restaurants, so.
Well, how many people though? How many people come off the freeway into downtown?
To go to Donna.
Yeah, to go to Donna's or El Tejano?
No,
They
It's
don't,
like gross
so,
inflation.
so by putting the commercial area out there, that doesn't hurt these guys.
But they'll still claim it does.
but the claimant does.
It's the pass-through
Yeah.
traffic too, the people you get driving up to the mountain or out to the wilderness area or something like that. Now they have other options. So the ones that have no options now, except for the 2 restaurants, gotta stop somewhere before they get off into the boonies and can't get a bite to eat, right? So now they have a dozen more options out at the interchange. So all that pass-through tourist traffic that you do get no
yeah.
longer has limited options. Now they have multiple options, and small businesses oftentimes can't stomach a couple of years of recovery.
Right.
That's just not in the cards for them. You know, they don't have that much cash reserves, and they've got, you know, bills to pay and employees to pay, so.
Sad truth of the matter is, the people that would, that live next to Betty's would go up to the highway to get McDonald's.
That
That's
would be
seriously
sad.
what it is, man.
Yeah, but that would be
It's so
sad.
expensive in town.
Yeah,
It's so expensive here,
exactly.
might drive the prices down, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
Plenty of people around here, surprisingly to me, will go to Rush Road just to get food and come back.
Yeah,
Hmm.
So at the core of our discussion, though, I mean, aside from some of the other consequences of zoning, but we're talking about, so we got industrial, we've got 2 industrial zones, commercial. We're somewhere between 1 and multiple.
Yeah, right. Somewhere in there.
And I don't know if I'm hearing any good, clear focus of that discussion. Is there something more that I can bring back that would help you to decide that? Because I really would like to move on to the residential zoning code that I prepared for tonight too, so I can keep evolving that. If you don't feel like you're ready to make a decision on 1 or multiple, you know, what more information can I bring back, or what more research could I do?
I guess just examples of neighboring towns that we're familiar with.
So I've got that
Really?
table there,
We've got a table here.
the comparative table of commercial zoning districts, and like I said, Kalama has 4, Kelso has 3, Napa Vine has 2. Would you like to see others and broaden that search out?
Now, if it was multiple and someone wanted to come in, could they apply for a variance and take it to planning?
If it was multiple and you,
Like if someone that was, if we went smaller to bigger, like if there was 2 zones, needed the smaller industrial. Or the lighter industrial and then bigger industrial.
so usually you can't use variance to circumvent code.
Okay.
But you can do creative things with conditional uses, and then conditional uses come to additional hearings and they're discretionary. So you could say that, you could have 2 zones, and then you could say that you've got a, looking at my examples here, kind of a general commercial and a community commercial. So if you had you could say that the community commercial uses are limited to these, the general commercials are allowed to do these. But as a conditional use, you can do either use in either zone, so that would come to review. But then you still have some non-discretionary standards. I mean, you're putting yourself in harm's way if you can't come up with a good reason not to approve a conditional use. So if you get a retailer that you don't want to be in that zone, but you've allowed other similar characteristics and other retailers to be in that zone,
Right.
you can't say, well, no, we don't like your name and your brand, we're not letting you go there. So
What about building size?
you can limit building sizes in either zone, but I think what Rachel was asking is, well, what about if you do get that one user that you want in that zone, and
Yeah.
he doesn't fit because his
Right.
building's too big?
Okay,
Can you allow them by a variance?
Yeah.
And you can't really do that by variance, but you could say that those are allowed as conditional uses. But then you'd have to evaluate it based on its merits. You wouldn't be able to
Pick and choose.
pick and choose. If you've allowed somebody, if your maximum commercial size is 20,000 square feet. And you allow somebody to go in with a 80,000 square foot building, then you can't not allow somebody else to go in if their uses, if it's the same use, right? I mean,
okay.
you'd have to be consistent about how you applied your code. Otherwise you'd get in trouble with the person that you were denying.
Is there a way legally to reference commercial developments of a certain size requiring a master plan?
Sure.
And then that would require the approval of planning commission and city council. And to get somebody at the table, if you want to.
So the simple way to do that with one commercial zone would be to use the conditional use permit. You could say up to 20,000 square feet, you're allowed. Anything beyond 20,000 square feet is a conditional use.
I
So
like that.
that gets what you're talking about. Because that has that tiering effect, but you still just have the one zone. But they're allowed to pick and choose anywhere. But those larger uses then are commercial or conditional uses because they have a larger impact. And then you can consider things like traffic and impacts to neighborhoods and other things through the conditional use process.
Does that make more sense?
It could work in a single zone scenario and would allow flexibility in location, because then when somebody called and asked, where is this allowed? Well, here's our commercial zone. You can go anywhere in there. You're a conditional use, you know, so that would elicit the right response, and then you'd at least show up on the consideration map. So that could work both ways for you. I don't see, I mean, the only downside, like I said, is that you still couldn't prohibit the one thing, you know, if a Dollar General wants to go in And they're over the 20,000, but you've allowed other 35,000 square foot buildings to go into
But
a
it
similar,
brings them to the table.
yeah. You know, like if somebody wanted to do a, what's that, coastal farm and ranch stores are usually pretty big too, those are usually like a 35 or 40,000 square foot building. So if one of those comes in and then Dollar General comes in and says, hey, I want to build one in that zone too, it's a conditional use and you got to approve me because you already approved these guys, unless you come up with some pretty crafty reasons why they were different, like, oh, well, you're routing all your traffic through a neighborhood, we can't approve that. But, you know, if everything else is the same, you would have to hold them to the same bar, you wouldn't be able to invent new criteria.
Well, I guess what I was getting at was allowing the use and saying, okay, if you want to come in here with the 80,000 square foot building as conditional use, and that goes, and that requires the
More
approval of more review. That it allows the city to have input into what the resulting product's going to look like. Yes, you're going to be able to build it, but there's our parameters on how that's gonna happen.
Mhm.
And I would rather have that, I don't wanna call it a hammer, but I'd rather have that. Participation from the city. Instead of just a blanket approval.
So it sounds like
Yes.
some trend toward a single zone with a size limitation with a conditional use option for bigger. Should the same apply to all uses like offices and, you know, truck stops or?
Well, I think they really should, because I mean, we're on a finite amount of land eventually. You know, it's not like we've got a gazillion places to go. And something that's gonna take up a considerable amount of space needs some due diligence by its elected or volunteer leaders. To make sure we get the product that we'd like to have out there. And I don't think we're gonna go California on them and be onerous and takes and this and that, but I think that we should have the ability to put some input into it.
Mhm. So with retail, I think that's easy. We can do it based on square footage. For office, we could do it based on number of stories or building square footage too. Or we could do it by employee head count, which would be kind of contrary to your idea about jobs. You know, if you're over 100 employees, then you require a conditional use permit. Because that's where the impact comes from, or you could just limit it by square footage. In office too, you could just come up with different numbers for square feet. I could look at some examples and figure out how many.
That makes sense?
That
It
sounds-
does, there's some good tools in there.
Yeah, it sounds the most
Yeah.
favorable to me.
Oh, that-
Okay.
that
Just to
works.
remind you that Brian has a hard stop at 7.
Right.
You have 15 minutes.
Well, and I think now I've got enough on commercial and industrial, where I can at least bring back a concept like I have on residential. Is that a good
Oh,
segue?
there's a segue. Wow, look at that.
Look at
Yeah, I'm
that.
gonna suggest that we go ahead and table the permit moratorium discussion till another month.
Can we continue our zoning discussion with residential?
Again.
Like you were moving ahead.
Now I'm just throwing an item in business.
Knocking them off as you can get them. So I put together an outline, the definitions of the residential zones. With low density, medium density, and high density. This kind of sets the character in case there's any question about whether something fits. Then we've got the permitted uses and development standards. So low density residential zone, single family homes, garden homes, and accessory structures such as garages and sheds. The R1 will also have to allow ADUs
Right.
in there per the new state rules, and I didn't include that in there, but all of your single family zones have to allow at least 2 ADUs per lot. If they fit.
Now, our downtown core that you're putting as residential, is that R1?
Yes. That block, those blocks downtown that you told me.
Right, okay.
So that would be
What
R1.
about What about duplex? Because we're putting 3 of them out there on Mission and Fifth, right?
Those would be legally existing non-conforming uses with the current map the way it is and with the current zone. So your duplexes are in your R2 medium density zone. And I think having been through that approval process, the neighbors around there would have appreciated if that weren't allowed use in that part of town. You know, even at I mean, I think the developer was more than gracious about reducing the density. But just hearing from that neighbor group, it's like, that's still too dense for us. We want something lower density. So it will make that a non-conforming use, even, you know, with the adoption of the new zoning code. But it will also protect the other parcels around there from doing the same thing.
Right.
And I think that was your intent in painting that swath through there.
Was,
The medium density residential zone does allow duplexes, townhomes, small multifamily complexes, and they 8 to 15 dwelling units per acre. So that wouldn't allow for a large scale apartment project, but it would allow for some smaller apartment complexes too, in that medium density. And then the highest density allows basically everything up 16 to 30 units an acre, multifamily apartment buildings, high-rise residential buildings, subject to your height limitations. Which I didn't actually include in this draft, which I probably, oh yeah, building height maximum 60 feet. So you're still limited to a 60-foot height, which is pretty tall.
pretty tall.
So you're talking pretty dense in that high density residential zone. So that's the character of the residential zones that I had. We're reading through some of those development standards, definitions. Does anybody have any comments on those? My next step with these will actually be to, right now it's kind of in a draft outline, but so I'll put them into a zoning code format. I'll give them a zoning code, I'll give them a zoning number, much like your zoning code is organized now. We're going to incorporate these into the Toledo City Code and probably try to do away with the separate code book that we have now. That's the development standards.
Right.
You put a lot of work into that, but it belongs in the city code book. So as we go through and do all these revisions, we're going to try to bring that back into the city code book and in its own chapter and section where it used to live.
Yes, please.
Our city, all the planning stuff is part of our codification too, so
Oh, good.
we'll have one big book up to
Yay.
date
Well, and now
and online.
and when you adopted your development regulations, you never repealed your code. So right now you have sometimes conflicting code
Oh, I'm sure,
sections.
we'll hear about it, yeah.
But this will fix that.
Yeah.
In the long run. So does that look good for residential? Does it look like I'm on the right track with?
It does.
with
Very
density?
much so,
Yeah.
very much so.
Building heights, I did put in there 35 feet for the R1, R2 is up to 45. Okay, the other piece I had was the mixed use commercial zone, because that was another painting color that I used downtown. So basically allowing a medium density residential zoning or commercial office, retail uses and professional office uses. The retail uses, I limited those to 10,000 square feet, and I think I clicked on the assessment records for the building that's across the street over here, and saw that that was about 8,900 and something square feet. So I thought we want at least that. So I rounded up to 10,000. So that's the use, that's the size of the commercial uses you're allowed to do in the mixed use commercial zone. And that's the colors now that we'll paint. We talked about the map tonight earlier, so I'll paint this zone on there. It'll be called your downtown commercial mixed use or something. So seem appropriate?
Very good.
For residential, 15 units an acre. With the limitation that it's only upper story residential to be built in new structures. Let's see, did I include, yes, waterfront mixed use? There, I went with a lower intensity of commercial use. So instead of allowing 10,000 like I did in the downtown, it's only 5,000 square feet. So really small scale commercial, 5,000 square feet isn't a very big retail use. Cafes, boutiques, so also restaurants and other things are also limited to that 5,000 square feet. So you wouldn't be able to do you wouldn't be probably even be able to do Donna's in the waterfront mixed use. That's over 5,000 square feet. So that's too big of a restaurant to be down on your waterfront. By the way, this code is written, all up for discussion. Allowing single family homes and cottages. And I'll have to add ADUs into there, in townhomes, duplexes, and small apartment buildings. So those uses are allowed in your waterfront mixed use zone for residential. And then just small scale commercial. So you're allowing up to 15 dwelling units an acre. Building heights up to 45 feet along the waterfront, which could impact views of the water from some of the single family residences that we now have behind it, which would be challenging for shorelines, but that's what that I tried to guess at what multi-story waterfront development might look like. We used that on the Ridgefield waterfront for some of the buildings that were closest to the water and then ramped up from there. When I did that planning work down there for the port. No minimum or maximum lot sizes, they just have to meet the lot density requirements and screening and setbacks. Parking, I took a stab at parking in that zone. 1.5 spaces per unit for residential and commercial, 1 space per 250 square feet. So for 20 spaces for the largest commercial use. So what you'd have 5,000 square feet if I'm doing the math right.
That's a tight squeeze.
Yeah. So I went through that kind of quickly. Is everybody okay with that concept or?
How many parking spots?
So for every 250 square feet of commercial uses in your waterfront mixed use area, you need to provide 250 square feet equals 1 space.
Right.
So if you have a 5,000 and you're limited to 5,000.
Let's say you try to max out at 5,000 and you've got 20 spaces. And 20 spaces is a minimum 10 by 18, 180 square feet. So 1,800 square feet of your lot is going to be parking. 5,000 and that, you're 6,800. You're almost exceeding the lot size as you are without any.
In order to do that, you need to consolidate lots along your waterfront. It wouldn't fit on one of your lots now, but you have no minimum or maximum lot sizes, so somebody could do that. They could buy 1 or more of those lots and if they wanted to max it out, it would be that plus the space for the residential. And in both of those zones, I made it an option to do either. I didn't require a mix of uses. So in both the downtown, the only limitation there is you're only allowed to do upper story residential. So that does require a commercial use underneath it. But we had talked about that very specifically last time. Do we want to allow people to do either or just one? So.
Well, it raises a question in my head. If somebody were to develop like that, would we as a city want them to then install curb gutter and sidewalk on their side of the street?
They'll have to do that by development regulations.
And then that would also add additional off-site parking.
Well, and they may have to actually dedicate right away too, depending on if the street comes up to your current road standards.
Right.
So if you have a non-standard street, they'd have to build their half width, which is sometimes more than a half. They'd have to add the curb gutter and sidewalk per your city street standards. And then if that road section allows for on-street parking, it would do that. I thought about trying to include an allowance for on-street parking. But that gets tricky in a developing community, because once it's been allocated to one person, there's really no allocation of public parking, right? I mean, somebody from your neighboring business could still park there. And then when I come in and develop next door, I'm gonna say, well, I don't need to do 20 spaces because there's 4 spaces in front, so I'm only gonna do 16 on my site. Well, but if everybody does 16 on their site, then you end up with a shortage of parking eventually, which would be a great problem, I guess, but.
The people across the street would be unhappy.
Yeah, you'd end up with, well, they're gonna be unhappy anyway, because they're close to commercial uses, so people are gonna be parking in residential neighborhoods and walking over to go to the shops and
Should be, that's interesting.
I think so, but I don't know, any,
No.
We're
Yeah, they're always.
people complain,
Right.
aren't we?
Yeah,
so it sounds like we're generally okay with the zones that I presented, so I can keep evolving those.
Yes, sir.
We had a great discussion on industrial and commercial, so I'll bring back something similar to this for our next meeting that's a little bit more evolved based on our discussion.
alright.
We'll see everybody at 5 o'clock next month.
Sounds like a plan.
Can I entertain a motion to,
Public comment.
huh?
Public comment first. You need to at least call for it.
Yeah,
Is there anybody in the public that would like to comment that hasn't? Do I hear a motion to adjourn? Do I?
Yes, you do.
yes. I'll
You do
second
hear
it.
that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Right.
Highly attended